like people are super intimidated by baking because they think it's such a rigid science and there's no room for play, and there's totally room for play, and there's very few rules that can't be broken. So I think the thing I love most about platinum yeast from Red Star is how easy it is to use. I mean, we just dump it into our recipe. We don't proof it first. Anytime you can take a step out of the process and make it easier, make it faster, more and more people are gonna try it. Watching somebody else enjoy what I've made is really what gives me love. Hi, I'm Zoe Francois, and welcome to my kitchen. I'm a pastry chef and a cookbook author, and today we're gonna be making the master recipe from one of my books. It's so simple. It's only 4 ingredients. We have flour, salt, water, and platinum yeast from Red Star, and we just dump it into a bucket. I'm using this 6-quart bucket, but you can really use a large bowl. You can do this in a stand mixer, anything that's large enough to fit about 4 loaves of bread. So we just dump it in. I'm starting with lukewarm water. You can use cold. Anything up to lukewarm is fine. If you go with cold water, just expect that the dough is going to take just a little bit longer to rise. So in goes the kosher salt. And then my platinum yeast, and I'm using about a tablespoon. Well, I'm using exactly a tablespoon, and that's just a little bit more than a packet. So I start with 1 packet into my measuring spoon. And then I'll need a little bit from a 2nd packet, and whatever is left over, I can just store in the refrigerator and use for my next project. And into there, so 1 tablespoon, and that goes into my bucket. And on top of that, I have all-purpose flour. I like to use a scale because I know every time I make the recipe, it's gonna be super consistent. If you're using a cup measure, I just recommend that you scoop the cup into the flour and then level it off. Don't spoon the flour into the cup, otherwise you won't have enough flour for your recipe. But really go with a scale because that's so much faster and you'll get a consistent dough every time. So the flour just goes in right on top there. You don't have to proof the yeast. The platinum yeast is so great. I know it works every time. You can proof it, but you just don't have to add that extra step. So everything goes into the bucket, just dump it in, and then I'm gonna stir it. I'm using this Danish dough whisk. It's a super cool looking tool, but also because it's not a flat surface, it goes through the dough really easily. You can use a wooden spoon, and like I said, you can do this whole thing in a stand mixer with the paddle attachment, and we're just stirring this dough until it comes together. I'm not kneading it. There's no need to knead this dough. It'll come together all on its own just by stirring. What I do want to do is make sure that I'm getting all the loose flour that sort of collects at the edges. And just get your tool in there, stir it around. This is gonna be a little bit messier, a little craggly, a little bit gloppy. It's not gonna be smooth, and don't worry about it. Just mix it until all of that stuff is together and you don't have any dry patches. That's it. We've made bread dough. So easy. This is such a great project for kids because they can just get in there and stir. So that's it. That's what our dough looks like. Maybe a little unusual for what you might be used to with bread. Get everything off my tool. So everything's in here. We have about 2 quarts of dough in here. The yeast is going to activate, and then it's gonna create this beautiful dough after about 2 hours. So we need to cover it up so that the dough doesn't dry out. The yeast creates gases, so you don't want to press your lid all the way on. You want to leave it just crack so that the gases have a way to escape. So 2 hours, we're going to come back and it's going to be gorgeous. Look at that, the yeast has done its thing and the dough is ready to go. And the thing that I love most about this method is that I've made enough dough for 4 loaves. And so they don't all have to be the same. So I'm gonna be making a boule, which is just a ball shaped dough. I'm gonna make a baguette. I'm gonna make an épi, which is a wheat stalk shaped loaf, and then I'm gonna add some olives to the dough and make a fougasse. So all out of this one simple bucket of dough, I can make all those shapes and more. So let's get started. You can see that all I did was stir it. I didn't knead it. The yeast did all the work for us. So what I love most about the Platinum yeast from Red Star is that it has a dough enhancer in it. And so it makes a dough stronger, it gives it more stretch. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna dust the top of it with some flour. I'm not adding the flour to mix into the dough, I'm just keeping this rather wet dough from sticking to my hands. So just a tiny bit on the top. And then I reach in, and you remember how sort of craggly that dough was? Look at this stretch that you get. And that is partly from that dough enhancer in the yeast. I'm gonna snip out about 1 pound. It's about the size of a grapefruit. You can weigh it, but you don't have to. So about the size of a small grapefruit, maybe a little bit bigger than that. I like to have a little bowl of flour nearby because, like I said, our dough is very wet by design. And so it's just nice to have some flour so it doesn't stick. You can use this dough right away after it has risen, or you can throw this into the refrigerator. If this is your first time working with our dough, refrigerating it for about 4 hours will make the dough much easier to work with. The other thing is that this dough can sit in the refrigerator for up to 2 weeks. And so as you want a loaf of bread, you just reach in like I did. I'm gonna flour my surface with quite a bit of flour because it's sticky dough. You don't want it to stick to your hands or to the counter. And then you can either shape it in your hands or put it on the counter like I did and just fold the edges into the center like this to form a ball. Turn it over, and now it's got a little bit of a coating of flour. What you want to do is not get flour, a ball of flour inside of your dough. So make sure that you sort of shake any excess flour out. In about 20 seconds, I'm just sort of pulling the top of the dough very, very gently around to the bottom, and voila, that's it. You have a boule or a ball. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put that on a sheet of parchment paper, dust the parchment with just a tiny bit of flour, and then rest my boule right there. And that's it. You can do this right on a pizza peel with some cornmeal, but I find that the parchment gives you a little bit of an insurance policy that it's not gonna stick because it's a wet, wet dough. So I'm just gonna put this on my peel, let this rest for about an hour. You can cover it with some plastic and we'll come back and then I'll show you how to get it into the oven. And this can go into the refrigerator for our next project. So an hour has gone by. The yeast did its magical thing and this bread is perfectly risen. And now it's time to get it into the oven. So before I put it in the oven, I'm going to score it because I want to have some control over what the loaf looks like, and also it helps the loaf to rise. You can do a couple of things. You can score it with a knife, with a serrated bread knife, or this cool bread lame. And I'm just gonna show you a really, really simple way, just one cut down the center, but this is where you can get super creative and do all kinds of designs. I'm just gonna dust the top of my loaf with some flour first because that's a nice contrast between the cut edge and the rest of the loaf. I like to use a little tea ball that I put flour into to dust it because it gives it a really nice even coat of flour. You can just dust it with your hands, but this is just a nice little trick to getting an even coat of flour. It also helps to prevent the knife from sticking to our wet dough. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna hold very, very gently. I'm going to just hold the dough and I'm going to slice about a 1/2 inch into it. So just like so. If you don't get a 1/2 inch deep, don't worry about it. Just go back over the cut. And that's perfect. So that's it. You can get a little bit fancier and do all kinds of designs on it. You've probably seen some really fancy loaves, but this is a great place to start, just super simple. So now I have my oven preheated and I'm gonna get my loaf into the oven. It's time to bake the loaf. I have in the oven a preheated baking stone, which radiates heat up so you get a really nice rise to your bread. I'm also gonna add steam to the oven. So I have a broiler pan on the bottom shelf. I'm gonna add water. There's gonna be this big steam that's gonna help the dough rise and also make a really nice shiny crust. For a baguette, I'm going to shape a ball. This one's smaller, about an 8-ounce size ball, or maybe the size of an orange. And I shape the ball just like I did with the boule. And then in order to work with it, it does help to let that ball rest for about 15 minutes because it just will allow you to work with it. When you shape the ball, it activates the gluten in the dough, and those dough enhancers from the yeast also create a really strong, stretchy dough, which is awesome. It's exactly what you want, but we need to let that relax just a little bit before we can shape it with ease. So I've let this ball rest for about 15 minutes, and now I can shape it into a baguette. I'm taking the ball and I'm just elongating it into an oval. And then what I'll do is I'll take one side of that oval and pinch it into the center. Just gently press it into the center, and then take the other side and create a seam going down. So you can already see, and if it's sticking to your hands, just a little bit of flour, and you can see I'm already getting the shape that I want. So that's it. Just take your ball, elongate it a little bit, and then create this shape. And it's a little bit sticky, so just some flour on your fingers helps. And then I always put that seam down so that it stays nice and closed. I roll it in a little bit of flour if it's sticky, and now I can stretch out my baguette like this. If you've let your dough rest, it should stretch fairly easily. If it's fighting back, just let it sit on the counter, move on to your next shape, or have a glass of wine or some tea, and just let the dough do its thing. You really can't fight it. It will always win. So I just let it relax. I like to rest that on a piece of parchment paper because I know when it's on the parchment paper that I can easily slide it into the oven and it's not gonna stick to my pizza peel. So just keep stretching the baguette until you get it the length that you want, and that looks perfect. Perfect, so that's it. That's so simple. I have a baguette shape. If you want to have a nice tapered end on your baguette, what I do is I just roll the ends between my palms, just like that. And then you get a nice point on the end of your baguette. So let me show you. So just roll the end like that. So you can see, then you have that nice shape. Now I'll just drape that with some plastic and let it rest. It has to do, that yeast has to activate again so that it will rise and have a beautiful texture on the inside. There's really nothing better than a crusty baguette. I mean, I think it's the most classic loaf of bread. So to finish off our baguette, I've let this rest for 40 minutes, so it's nice and proof. The yeast has done its thing. The traditional way to finish it off is to not have a dusting of flour, but to have an egg wash. An egg whitewash, because that gives you a glossy finish without really adding much of a color to it. So I just am doing the whites because then I have a really nice glossy crust. So just a little bit. You don't want to be pouring a lot of egg on here. It's not part of the recipe. It's just a very, very light brushing. And then I'm going to take either a really sharp bread knife or a bread lame, which is just basically a razor blade that you can use to slice your loaf. So I'm just gonna make 3 cuts down the length of my baguette. So I'm gonna start at the tip here, and I'm going to do about a 1/2 inch deep going down. It's very sticky, so if it doesn't go through the first time, don't worry about it, just reinforce that cut. Then I'm gonna start overlapping those slashes with my second cut. There you go. And you won't really even see these cuts until they start to open up. You get this oven spring when you put it into the oven, and then they'll open up and be really beautiful. And then my last slash. So reinforce that. And you can see that it is starting to open up a little bit. And then slide that onto my baking or my pizza peel, and into the oven we go. And that's it. For the épis, I'm gonna do the exact same thing. I'm gonna make a baguette first. And this too needs to relax and rest and rise and let that yeast do its magical thing. And then we'll come back and we'll shape it into the épis. This is one of those exciting breads that looks super hard to make. Nobody can quite figure out how you did it, and it's so simple. So when we come back, I'll show you exactly how. So just let that relax and we'll be back. I have to say this is one of my favorite loaves to make because it's such a surprise when people see it. And so part of what I love about baking is demystifying the process, because sometimes you look at something and it looks so difficult and it really is so easy. So let me show you. I'm gonna dust this with some flour. I'm using a tea ball just to make sure that that flour is nice and evenly dusted. It just looks prettier. You can absolutely just do this by dusting it with your fingers, but a nice even coat all the way down. One, because it adds a really beautiful contrast from the cut edges to the toasty brown inside of the bread, but also because it prevents your scissors from sticking to the risen dough. You can see that this dough rose. It was about 40 minutes, and now we're ready to snip it. It's very important that you snip right before you put it in the oven. So what you do is you take your shears. I like to use shears that have a really long blade. You don't want those short, fat kitchen shears that are, you know, meant for cutting up a chicken or something, because they're too short. You want something nice and long. And you're gonna go in about a 20-degree angle, and you're just gonna snip that dough, just like that, and then off to the side. And that's it. And then next one, you snip it. You're going almost all the way to the paper, but not quite, because they would need to stay attached. And then the next one, and off to the side. And now you're creating that wheat stock look. So it's called an épis in French. but it's really creating the top of that wheat stock. And that's it. We're gonna slide that onto a pizza peel because you don't want to lift this up and have it sliding around or moving around. Otherwise it might start looking like an ivy. And then this will go straight into the oven, but it's so beautiful. One of the best things about our method is that you have this big bucket of dough and you can play with it. So you're not making one precious loaf. You can play with your food. I highly recommend it. I'm gonna be making an olive fougasse. And what that is a loaf that's infused with olives and olive oil, and it's aromatic and it's beautiful, and it's one of my husband's favorite loaves. So I'm starting the same way. I'm just gonna sprinkle some flour over my dough because again, it's a little bit sticky. And I'm gonna pull some of this dough out. Look at that stretch. It amazes me every time. I'm gonna pull out about a pound of it and put it on my counter. It's very sticky. So again, use enough flour that it's not gonna stick to your counter. So get some good amount of flour down under there. I'm not gonna form this one into a ball because I want to stretch it out. I don't wanna get all that gluten excited before I stretch it out. So a little bit on top just so it won't stick. And I'm gonna stretch this out to about a ½ inch thick. So that looks about right. You don't have to get it into a neat shape, just a ½ inch thick, any shape it decides to be, because we're gonna roll this up after I put the olives inside. So there we go. We have our dough all rolled out. I have some chopped olives, but really with this recipe, you can get creative. You can put just about any flavor that you want in here. I'm making this olive fougasse, which is a savory bread, but you could put raisins and nuts or anything that you're in the mood for. So lots and lots of olives because I want them to stud the whole bread. That looks great. Now I'm gonna fold this into the loaf. So just folding it in, locking those olives into my loaf. I want to put a few more on the top just to make sure every little bite is gonna have some olives. And now I'm gonna form the ball. So again, just like I've done before, I'm going to fold that into a ball. I'm gonna let this rest because I've been playing with it and that gluten is gonna get all excited. I'm gonna let that rest for about 15 minutes and then I'm gonna roll it out into my fougasse. So now we're ready to shape it. What I'm gonna do is take this and roll it out to about a ½ inch thick. So a little bit more flour. As it was resting, it gets a little sticky. I'm gonna take my rolling pin and just roll that gently. Make sure I have enough on there that my rolling pin isn't sticking. Gently out to a ½ inch. And this rested for about 20 minutes, and that's all it really needs. It's about 20 minutes, and then we'll shape it and get it right into the oven. Whoop. So yeah, if it's gonna stick to your pin, you wanna make sure too that it's not sticking underneath. And if it is, this is your friend. So just very gently lift it up, put some more flour down, and you're back to work. I think this is one of the more surprising things is how much flour I'm using, but that's because this dough is so wet, it really can handle quite a bit of flour for working. Now what I'm gonna do is grab my baking sheet that has parchment paper on it. You don't absolutely need the parchment, but I always like parchment because it's just easier for cleanup. And then I'm just gonna drizzle some olive oil on the parchment. One, so that my bread doesn't stick, and also because it infuses the bread with that beautiful flavor from the olive oil. So use a nice olive oil. Okay, so there, lots of olive oil you want in that dough. And then I'm just gonna drape this right onto the parchment paper. And you can see that I have sort of, what is that shape? Like an egg shape. It doesn't have to be a round. We want this to actually be sort of a unique shape to it. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut slats because the fougasse is supposed to be like a ladder shape. So I'm just gonna take a little paring knife and I'm gonna create slats. There's no rules. You can decorate this exactly the way you want. You just wanna have some slats cut all the way through the dough, just like this, as many as you want. And each one can be different. This is nice with some red pepper, like roasted red pepper in here. That would be really pretty poking through. So you can get really creative here. Now, before I pop this into the oven, I want to stretch those cuts open so that they stay open when they're baking. You don't want them to close back up because then you lose the shape. So just make sure they're cut through, and then we'll just stretch this nice and thin, opening up those slats that we've created. And you can reinforce them again. There we go. So that's it. Super simple. I'm gonna drizzle this with even more olive oil to get that flavor infused in there. This would be really nice with some rosemary also. A drizzle. I love olive oil, so just a drizzle of olive oil, and this is ready for the oven. Our crusty boule came out of the oven and it looks gorgeous. You can see that the yeast activated. We got that gorgeous oven spring. So even though it wasn't really risen that high when we slashed it, it did it in the oven and it's beautiful. Now's the hard part. You have to wait before you cut into it. You really can't cut into hot bread because it needs time to release the steam and then the crust develops and it just gets better and better, but it takes a little while for that to happen. So there's our boule, but then we also made this gorgeous épi or wheat stock. So that's what it looks like after it's been baked. You can see the contrast of that flour and the really golden, beautiful dough inside. And then we have our classic baguette. It's always a winner. It's perfect for dinner. Goes together super, super fast. And then our olive and olive oil fougasse, which just is so gorgeous and has so much flavor. It's just beautiful. And all of these recipes came from that one simple, easy, really brilliant bucket of dough. So you can have everything that I made here today out of that one bucket. So it's better baking made super, super easy. And you can find all of these recipes at redstaryeast.com/platinum. And you'll find all the recipes and more. So enjoy.